Who are the locks to make the Green Bay Packers in 2023? It may be fewer than you think. We talk about it on today's show.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet. And the show for fans who know what happened, they want to know why and how. Thanks to everyone who makes Locked On Packers their first listen every day. We hope you like starting your day with us as much as we like starting our day with you. Today's episode brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. I was putting together my roster projections for our Leap Final 53 projections, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. And I was struck how in the moment it was easier in some places than I expected, but much more difficult in others. And what really stood out to me was a couple positions. And this is true almost every year, where you have a handful of positions where you have these decisions to make, these pivot points. And I wrote about this earlier in the week for The Leap. I'm not going to do the bit again. And I think the trenches is where you have the most questions. That is where you're going, okay, what do the numbers look like here? Offensive line, defensive line, outside linebacker. Some of this was made a little bit easier because Jake Hansen, he was waived injured. So going unclaimed, he reverts to their IR, but does not count on their 53-man roster. He is someone who could, theoretically, at some point, come back on their team. But the one position that really, and I mean really stood out to me, was safety. Safety. I had one lock. One lock. Now, they're going to have more than one safety on this roster. But there's only one player in this group I am certain, or something close to certain, is actually going to be on the team this year. So that means there's either still a lot to be decided, and or there's a lot of volatility here, or a lot of what is going to go into this decision has essentially already been decided based on roster construction concerns. So Donald Leavitt, for example, gets brought in for special teams. He's going to be the special team guy no matter what. That's just what it is. That's possible. That's certainly possible. So we'll have to figure out as we go through this where these pieces fit together. On the offensive line, questions about numbers. How many do you have to keep? Can you sneak a developmental guy on? What does David Bakhtiari's future mean for this team? What is the potential trade market that's out there? The desirability of your players. How does that play into the way that you want to put together the construction of your roster? How about positional versatility along the defensive front? If you have a pass rusher, for example, let's call him Lucas Van Ness, who, let's say, has been getting some defensive line reps, was getting some in practice yesterday, can you be a little bit more flexible along the defensive line and not keep an extra defensive lineman because you have someone like Lucas Van Ness? Or is it the case that you need to keep an extra big body, an extra guy who could, in a pinch, play nose because you feel like you have some depth concerns there? And then on the outside, speaking of outside linebacker, will you be able to fit on the mercurial, let's use that word, outside linebacker who had issues in college staying on teams, but has shown incredible promise so far in preseason games. How many of those guys can you keep? It seems like you have 5 or 6 guys who are locked into those spots. I have 5 outside linebacker locks. This group is extremely deep. So where do you find those other players? And then receiver is the sexiest one. How many can they realistically keep? And we're going to go through position by position. We're going to go offense and defense. But what struck me going through this is there were times when I'm going, can I really justify keeping this many players at this position? And then I'm like, well, who am I going to keep off? Who am I keeping off? And who's better of those 2 players? And ultimately for me, it's about finding the best 53-man roster. I want to find the 53 most talented guys. That's not always the motivation of coaches, and that's not always the motivation of general managers. Brian Gutekunst has been, and notorious is overstating it, but he has certainly been consistent in keeping his guys. If you get drafted by Brian Gutekunst, certainly in the year you're drafted, you're going to make the team and probably get 2 years to prove you belong in the NFL, or at least belong on the Green Bay Packers. So how does that play into all of this? And it does make me go back to something that Bob McGinn used to say, and that was, pretty rarely do you actually have too many players. And what ends up happening, because football is the way that it is guys get hurt and you end up needing the depth. And so it turns out you didn't have too many guys. It turns out you have just enough. That's usually how this plays out. So the worrying about who is going to make it on practice squads, that kind of stuff, tends to be overrated. It tends to be overrated because how many times can you think of a player that the Packers signed after the 53-man cutdown that went on to be extremely important to the team? How many times can you think of a player the Packers cut as part of final roster cutdowns? Not just like, oh, this veteran is overpriced, the Josh Sitton. That went to another team and was hugely impactful for them. It's just generally not how this works. So I had 43 locks. That means I have 10 spots that I have to try and fill. We're going to go through them piece by piece, position by position, and have these discussions. We're not doing the full Matt LaFleur, Brian Gutekunst bit. I know, that is a popular one. Jason Hirschhorn was on the show yesterday. He is America's guest for a reason, of course, but we're not doing that bit this year. Maybe we'll find a reason to bring it back for some reason. Maybe around the trade deadline, we could do it just to say we did it. But we're going to go through the offense and the defense with my 53-man roster projection right after this. Buying tickets is often the most stressful part of any event. It's not going and paying for parking or finding a parking spot or worrying about how much money you're going to spend on food or merch or whatever it is. It's getting the tickets. And that shouldn't be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for all of the fun you're going to have. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event with exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, more. The Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price too. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. That's how confident they are that they will get you the best price. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms and conditions apply. That's right. Create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. And thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen every day. Every dayers. We're back tomorrow to get you set for Packers Seahawks, and then we're going to go live after the game on YouTube. Tomorrow's our last preseason show. Because once the last preseason game happens, it is no longer preseason, baby. So let's enjoy it. Offensively, a couple interesting conversations I think to be had here. The quarterback one is easy. Jordan Love, Sean Clifford. Those are your quarterbacks. Running back is a little bit more fraught, a little bit more complicated because we know the locks, A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones. After that, no one's certainly a lock. But then how do you go about roster construction? How do you want to attack the players that you can add to this team at that position? And they only had 2 on the roster last year and then used the practice squad. I know I said Emmanuel Wilson is making it really hard not to put him on the 53. I think I might have even said Emmanuel Wilson 53 in Sharpie. I'm backing off that a little bit. He's not Sharpie. He's not a lock. I'm not even sure if they keep a third running back. It will be him at this point. But in the moment, you get a little caught up in things. He's a really fun player. I hope they're able to get him on the practice squad. But let's just think about the guys. If they only keep 2, these are the guys that they could potentially put on the practice squad. Patrick Taylor, Tyler Goodson, Lou Nichols, who we haven't even seen play, but is an appealing player to me. I think has a lot of talent. And then Emmanuel Wilson. That's 4 guys that all have at least some level of like, hey, I want to see that guy do a couple things. Running backs are the easiest position in the league to fill. So you don't have to go nuts allocating resources there. I don't think the difference between keeping Patrick Taylor versus Tyler Goodson versus Emmanuel Wilson versus Lou Nichols III, I don't think there's really that big a difference there, which to me says, don't keep any of them. Let 1 or 2 get to your practice squad and be happy about it and let everyone else go with God. I think that is the smart way to build this roster because running backs grow on trees, and especially in this offense, any of them are going to be fine. Everyone runs this scheme. No, you're never going to find a running back and go, hey, can you play this wide zone scheme? Yes, of course I can. I've been doing it since I was 12. And if I'm an NFL player and I was in an NFL camp, even if I'm a rookie, I was probably in an NFL camp with a team that runs the wide zone. So, not going to be a problem for anyone coming in. Tight end is another one where it's connected, like fullback and tight end. There's an interconnectivity there. Henry Pearson, I don't think is going to make this team. So you have Luke Musgrave, Tucker Kraft, Josiah DeGuara. Those guys are making the team. Then the question becomes, okay, what do you do after that? And I've been seeing on some of the projections, other people have been doing like this tight end waiver wire, to be announced later. Basically, like it's like an NBA or a baseball trade and a player to be named later. It's like waiver wire tight end to be named later is going to be the other tight end that they put on the team. I think certainly that is in play. I mean, it would not surprise me if that's the case, but that's also the kind of thing you do when you really are either worried about your starters or you want a veteran to stabilize a room, and that's just clearly not the direction that they're going. They're fine riding out with the young guys. But at a certain point, you need bodies. And I think because Josiah DeGuara plays a little bit of a different role, you have to keep another tight end, whether it's keep or have. But Austin Allen has been on this team since January. They went out and they actually claimed him for the last game of the season. He's gone through the offseason process with them, been there since the spring. This is not just some guy that they just picked up off the street. And he's got some upside. He's got some size, to be sure. We haven't seen him get really any opportunities in the preseason. I hope that we get to see some in the Seattle game. This is usually the game where the starters play very little, and it's those end of the roster guys that get their opportunity to play. And hey, can you play your way onto a role on this team? We'll see. So if I got 10 spots to play with, He's one of them for me. Offensive line. I have 9 locks. And it's the starters plus Yosh Nijman, Sean Rhyan, Royce Newman, and Rasheed Walker. I'm less convinced in the moment right now as we record this that all 9 of those guys are locks, just because I mentioned at the top the opportunity to use this depth that the Packers have at offensive line to benefit the Packers in ways that are not about those players playing on the field is really intriguing to me. Take advantage of the fact that this is, for my money, the deepest offensive line group in football. They have almost a second starting 5 with Yosh Nijman and Rasheed Walker, who are starting caliber tackles. Like, I think those 2 guys are better than like 5 or 10 teams today. And then you add in Sean Ryan's improved play. Royce Newman was a preferred starter on a 13-win team, which is pretty remarkable. And then just like peel back, grab Jake Hansen if he weren't hurt. And you'd have a starting offensive line, a starting 5 that is better than some teams will trot out right now. Can you use that to your advantage? Can you say, okay, New York Jets, we're not going to trade you David Bakhtiari, but we will consider Royce Newman. We will consider Yosh Nijman. Pay up. And there are certainly other teams for whom that could be true. An injury, you never know what happens. But I think the Packers, that is something that I'm interested in. And it's a way to clear a roster space for someone who you might want to develop, who might be a long-term part of your conversation. And so this is where I use another one of my spots. I want Caleb Jones on the 53. I think he makes it. I think they really love him. And here's the quick explanation for why, because I want to talk about the receivers. In a year, David Bakhtiari might not be on this team. Yosh Nijman will be an unrestricted free agent. So if you think Rasheed Walker can come in and be your starting left tackle, you've got Zach Tom, maybe you flip those guys. I think that works. I think from a body type standpoint, from an attribute standpoint, that works. But keep it where it is too, that's fine too. Now you need that swing tackle. If you expose Caleb Jones to be claimed around the league, I just think he's going to be claimed in terms of pedigree, in terms of size, in terms of the program that the Packers put together. They have proven they are one of, if not the best, offensive line development spaces in the league. And so other teams that need offensive linemen are going, why don't I, like, it's the same. Eagles, let's just grab one of those guys. Browns, let's just grab one of those guys. Chiefs, let's just grab one of those guys. Like, there are places where you just know you're getting quality offensive line. He's your swing tackle in a year, potentially. And that's a really valuable position on any team, to have a player like that who could get even better. That is what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about this a year in advance, because if you expose him to be claimed, I don't like phrasing it, exposed twice. I did it the first time and my brain went, don't say that. That sounds weird. And then I did it again because it was in my brain going, wow, that was a weird way of phrasing that, even though it is exactly the right word. Let's talk about receivers. I have 5 locks. Watson, Dobbs, Reed, Toure, Wicks. I think if Dubose weren't hurt all training camp, he would be something close to a lock, and then you'd have 6, but then that leaves Malik Heath. I think if you're going to argue, Samori Toure was one of the hardest locks that I had, which I think you can make the case, like, if it's a difficult choice to make someone a lock, then they're not a lock. But they need some level of experience in this receiver room. And even though he's only had 1 year of experience, that's 1 year more than Dubose, Wicks, and Reed, which is half your receiver room. And if you add Malik Heath, it's more than half of your receiver room. And that's the other name here. So I think Dubose makes it. I think they keep 7. And Malik Heath. Malik Heath was opened with the ones in the first team reps yesterday at practice. It was Malik Heath and Christian Watson at receiver. Now, Wicks is hurt. Dubose is dealing with an injury. That's part of this. But those guys weren't starters. It could have been Dobbs. It could have been Jaden Reed playing on the outside. It could have been Samori Toure. It wasn't. It was Malik Heath. I think he's too good to not want on your team. Forget like another team claiming him. I think he's just flat out better to me. I'd rather have him than Samori Toure. And I'd rather have him than the other two rookies right now, the day 3 rookies, Wicks and Dubose, right now today. If I had to play a football game right now today, I'd want him as my third boundary receiver. That's just where I am. Now, the Packers could have different thoughts, but I think that's what makes the most sense for this team. So I had 10 spots. Caleb Jones, Austin Allen, Grant Dubose, Malik Heath. That's 4. That means I have 6 spots left for this defense. And that's where this gets really, really interesting. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen every day. Everydayers, we're live on Saturday afternoon, early evening after the game, talking about what happened, what might have changed in terms of some of these projections, that conversation. The Leap newsletter is going to go out after that with our 53-man roster projections. So keep an eye out for that. Plus Locked On Sports today. It's the biggest stories in sports and under 20 minutes. We have an unparalleled network of local analysts here on the Locked On Podcast Network. No one has local experts like we do, and we take advantage of that. It's a show I host. I love hosting it. Under 20 minutes, all the big stories in sports that you need. Defensively, I've got 6 spots here to play with. Defensive line, I've got 5 locks. I'm not adding anybody. Kenny Clark, Devontae Wyatt, TJ Slayton, Colby Wood, and Carl Brooks. I don't think I need to because I think they're going to play a lot of 2 true defensive lineman fronts, and so 5 is more than enough. I think you can get Jonathan Ford on the practice squad. That is the guy, because if TJ Slayton gets hurt, then the only player on your roster who you really feel comfortable truly playing the nose is Kenny Clark. Carl Brooks is not that guy. Colby Wooden, not that guy. They're penetrators. Devontae Wyatt, not that guy. They are slashers. But that's what the practice squad is for. They have 2 guys who can credibly play the nose. You don't need to keep Jonathan Ford on this roster. This is where I come back to this idea of like, okay, well, should I really keep 7 receivers? Well, who am I keeping off? Jonathan Ford? Okay, fine. I'd much rather have Malik Heath or Grant Dubose or Caleb Jones than Jonathan Ford. I can get Jonathan Ford out of the practice squad, and if I don't, fine. I'll see if I can find a nose tackle somewhere else. Outside linebacker. This is really just a Brenton Cox question because there's 5 locks. It's Gary, it's Smith, it's Van Ness, it's Enigbari, and it's Hollins. Those guys are on the team. So then it's what do you do with Brenton Cox? He's got to be on. The pedigree, the productivity, and then the professional tape. He's got 2 preseason games as an ass kicker. It's on tape. Is it perfect? No. There's still ball awareness issues. That goes back to college. There is the questions about the off-the-field awareness. Remember, this is a guy who got kicked out of 2 blue blood programs in college football as a productive player. Do you know how hard it is to get kicked out of college football programs if you're good? Like, it is nearly impossible. And he did it not once, but twice. Like, the knucklehead quotient here is potentially high. It certainly was in college. That doesn't mean as he becomes not a 22-year-old anymore, he can't mature and develop and all those things. So far, been doing what is asked of him. Practiced the right way, produced in games, looks like a really productive player. And that is where I just, like, these guys are too rare. What is the long-term outlook of Preston Smith on this team? We'll see. Is Justin Hollins is on a 1-year deal. Maybe he wants to go and try and earn a more frontline role elsewhere. Then you've got Van Ness, you've got Enigbari, you've got Gary. You got to pay Gary, by the way, but I think they're going to do that. You need another guy. Brenton Cox can be that guy. So short-term and long-term, this makes the most sense. Corner. Now, Eric Stokes, not counted on this list. I think he's going to start on PUP. If he weren't going to start on PUP, he'd be off PUP. Like, we're running out of time here for him to get on the field. So even if he's activated, then he does start to count against the 53, but we're 2 weeks away from an actual game being played in the NFL. If you're still on the PUP now, the chances you're going to be ready for week 1, I think, pretty low. So that leaves the Packers with 4 corners: Russell Douglas, Jair Alexander, Keyshawn Nixon, Carrington Valentine. Now, Carrington Valentine can play on the outside. So that's nice. That fills the void, at least the role of what Eric Stokes was going to do for you. I think you need one more. So then it becomes Keandre Thomas versus Shamar Jean-Charles versus Corey Ballantyne. For me, I want the special teams, because if this guy's playing meaningful snaps early on, like something's gone horribly wrong. I have 3 guys who can credibly play on the outside. I'm not really worried about that, so give me the special teamer. I don't think Shamar Jean-Charles can play on the outside. Keandre Thomas profiles ideally as a practice squad player, so I'm going to grab Corey Ballantyne here. And I've got 4 spots left to figure out safety and linebacker. And those are tricky spots. Darnell Savage is my only lock. My only lock at safety. They're going to keep Moore. He's my only lock. Rudy Ford was close. And I'm going to be honest with you, Anthony Johnson Jr. was also really close to being a lock. So those 3 guys, for me, make sense. So now I have 2 spots left. So I have Savage, Anthony Johnson Jr., and Rudy Ford. Anthony Johnson Jr. playing a ton of special team snaps. Can he be a core special teamer? We'll see. How many of these guys do you need is the question. And then if you look at who's left, you signed Tarvarius Moore and Jonathan Owens in the offseason, but neither of those guys are necessarily going to be starters. It doesn't look like either of them right now are going to be starters, frankly. And you have Dallin Leavitt, who you signed last offseason to be a special teamer for you. So can you get special teams from one of Tarvarius Moore, Jonathan Owens? Owens was a starter last year in Houston, but Moore is a special teams player with the 49ers. So there's some crossover there. They actually think Moore can play, so maybe that gives him the upper hand. But Jonathan Owens spent much more time running with the ones, has the athletic ability to be a special teams player, is a tackler. It's an interesting discussion to be had. I think ultimately, Owens is the guy that I think stays, and that leaves Dallin Leavitt and Tarvarius Moore off this roster for the moment, because I have 1 spot left. 4 safeties. I have 3 locks at inside linebacker: Devondre Campbell, Quay Walker, Isaiah McDuffie. I don't love any of these other players, but I need someone. And this is where being a draft pick, I think, helps someone like Tariq Carpenter, who has not shown anything in the NFL to suggest that he should ever be playing defense. That's not to say he can't develop. He's changing positions, all those things. But they've changed his position now a couple times. He said he was playing edge rusher in practice at the end of last year. Like, that is usually a sign things are going poorly, unless you're someone like Zach Tom, where it's just like, how can we get this guy to play everywhere? That's not what this is. This is struggling to find a fit for a guy. And so you go, can we try him here? Can we try him here? Let's try him here. It's not the best. So I'm going to go with Eric Wilson, the linebacker, special teams player, was a core special teamer last year. I think that's what you need in that linebacker 4 spot. If he's ever playing real football for you, that's a problem. You can find linebackers on special teams. So maybe you don't need to do this, and maybe you can keep the extra safety. Maybe you can keep Dallin Leavitt. I think they would try to do that. Rich Bisaccia has had an outsized impact on roster construction since he's been in the building. But 3 off-ball linebackers, even for a team that's going to play a lot of single linebacker, off-ball linebacker looks, I just don't think that works. It just, from a pure body standpoint, it just doesn't work. So I think he has to be on the list. That's my 53. We got to 10. 6 defenders, 4 offensive players extra from your 43 locks. That's 53 by my math. Yeah, I think that works. We're back tomorrow to get you set for Packers Seahawks. Then we're going to go live on YouTube after the game. And if you haven't yet, and it's possible that by the time you're listening to this, I've already given the tickets away, but we're still doing the ticket giveaway. Join subtext, send me a text that says, I want these tickets. I've got 6 tickets to Packers Seahawks on Saturday afternoon. They're good seats. 30-yard line seats. visitor side. Go check out Subtext. We're having a great time over there. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers. And anytime you want to come hang out with us live, you can do that over on our YouTube page. So you can stay Locked On Packers.